The dust had become a part of her. It lived in the worn seams of her gray dress, in the fine lines around her eyes, and coated her tongue with the taste of every mile she had walked. 40 miles. She had counted them by suns and sorrows, by the wearing thin of her husband's last good pair of boots on her feet, until the soles were little more than suggestions of leather. Her name was Reva Maddox, and she was 28 years old, though the land had aged her beyond her years. She walked with her right hand closed around something small and round, a wedding band made of copper. It had been Simon's gift on the day they married in a one-room church outside of Denver, and it had fit her finger perfectly then. Now it slipped and slid too loose on a hand that had grown too thin. She tucked it into the pocket of her dress, felt it settle against her hip like a small, cold heart, and kept walking. The prairie stretched out in every direction, an ocean of dry grass under a sky so wide it made a person feel like the last living thing on earth. She passed the skeleton of a wagon that had been abandoned on the side of the trail, its canvas top long since torn away by wind. A child's blanket lay draped over the seat, bleached nearly white by the sun, but still holding the faint shape of where small hands had clutched it. Reva looked at it for a long moment, something moving behind her eyes, something she pressed down hard and locked away. She turned her face forward and kept walking. 6 months. That was how long she had been walking in one way or another since the world ended. Not the whole world, just hers. Sidon Maddox had been a miner. A good one, the foreman had said, which meant he was fast and he was careful, and neither of those things mattered when the ceiling of a silver mine decided to come down. They told her on a Tuesday. She remembered that the day of the week because she had been hanging laundry and thinking about what to cook for supper. A man she had never met came to the door of the company house with his hat in his hands and dirt on his face, and he said the words, and the laundry kept flapping on the line as if nothing had changed. The mining company gave her 48 hours to vacate the house. Company property, they said. For company men. She packed what she could carry into a bundle tied with twine and walked out the door with Sidon's boots on her feet because her own shoes had worn through months ago. She tried 3 towns. In the first, a woman at a boarding house looked at her and said they did not take in women without husbands or family. In the second, she found work washing sheets for a hotel, but the owner's wife accused her of stealing a pillowcase and threw her out before the week was done. In the third, a small settlement on the edge of the plains, she made a mistake. A saloon keeper's daughter had a fever that would not break, and the child was wasting away while the town's nearest doctor was 3 days' ride distant. Reva knew what to do. Her mother had taught her years ago in the green hills of Appalachia before consumption took her. She brewed a tea of elderflower and willow bark, bathed the child in cool water, steeped with peppermint, and by morning the fever was gone. The saloon keeper's wife did not thank her. She called her a witch woman and told her to get out before sundown, and the men in the saloon watched her go with hard, suspicious eyes. That was the lesson the world kept teaching Reva Maddox. The knowledge her mother had given her, the medicine of leaf and root and earth, was not a gift. It was a mark. It was a thing that made people afraid. So she walked. She walked east across the plains with her bundle on her back and her dead husband's ring in her pocket and her mother's leather pouch of dried herbs pressed against her ribs. She walked because there was nothing behind her, and because she had heard a name spoken in a dry goods store by men who did not know she was listening. The Bartee, a ranch run by a man named Obed Sedgewick, a man who needed hands. She did not know if she had hands left to offer. They were raw from lye soap and cracked from wind, but they were all she had. She crested a low-rise on the afternoon of the 4th day, the prairie grass whispering dry secrets around her ankles, and she saw it. It was not just a ranch. It was a kingdom carved out of the unforgiving land. A sprawling main house of dark, sturdy timber sat at the center like a fortress. Barns bigger than any church she had ever seen flanked it on either side, and the fences ran straight and true until they vanished into the curve of the earth. Horses moved in a far corral, their coats catching the light. Cattle dotted the distant hills like scattered stones. This was not a place that had been given. This was a place that had been taken, seized from the wilderness by force of will. A dog barked, a deep rumbling sound that carried a warning across the yard. Men stopped what they were doing, hammers paused mid-swing, ropes coiled but not thrown, and turned to stare at the lone figure of a woman appearing out of the heat, shimmer like a ghost. They saw the exhaustion. They saw the poverty in the faded cloth of her dress. They saw a problem, not a person. Reva straightened her spine. It was a small act of defiance against the ache in her bones, but it was all the armor she had. She had not walked 40 miles to be turned away by a stare. A man detached himself from a group near the corral. He was broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by the brim of a sweat-stained hat. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of authority. This was not the owner. This was a man who worked for him, a foreman whose job was to keep trouble at a distance. "This is private property, missus," he said, his voice as gritty as the ground beneath her feet. He stopped a few paces from her, his hands resting on his hips, his eyes moving over her the way a man looks at a lame horse assessing damage. "You lost." "No," she said. Her own voice was raspy from thirst and disuse, and she cleared her throat. "I am looking for work. I heard Mr. Ashford was hiring." The foreman's name was Boone, and he had been running the day-to-day operations of the Bar T for 7 years. He was a practical man, not a cruel one, but the frontier had taught him that sentiment was a luxury. His eyes swept over Reva, taking in the slender frame, the boots that were falling apart, the visible fatigue that she wore like a second skin. "We are hiring ranch hands," he said. "Men who can rope and ride. You do not look the part." "I can cook. I can clean, men do laundry, anything." Boone shook his head. "Last season a woman came through here selling remedies out of a carpet bag. 3 of my men ended up sick as dogs after drinking her tonic. One of them nearly died. We do not need that kind of trouble wearing a dress." The words hit her like a slap, not because they were directed at her, but because they told her something about this place. The door was not just closed. It was barred from the inside by a memory she had no part in. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a voice cut through the air from the direction of the main house. "What is it, Boone?" The foreman turned. The man who approached was taller, leaner, and moved with a stillness that was more commanding than any swagger. The sun caught the silver at his temples, though the rest of his hair was dark. His face was all harsh angles and deep shadows carved by sun and wind, and something deeper than either. Something that looked like loss worn so long it had become bone. This was Obed Sedgewick. He did not look at Reva. He looked at his foreman, expecting an answer. "Woman looking for work, Mr. Ashford," Boone said. "Told her we have got nothing." Obed Sedgewick's eyes finally fell on her, and they were gray, the color of a storm-tossed sky just before the lightning comes. They held no warmth at all. He saw what Boone had seen, the poverty, the exhaustion, the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. But his gaze was sharper, more dissecting. It went to the blisters on her heels where the ruined boots had rubbed her raw, and then it went to the boots themselves. Something changed in his expression, a tightening of his jaw, a brief flicker in those cold eyes. The boots were men's boots, work boots, the kind a miner would wear. He was looking at the shoes of a dead man on the feet of a living woman, and he understood what that meant. His gaze was an intrusion, and Reva felt a flare of anger that gave her strength. She met his stare and did not look away. "I am not asking for charity," She said her words clear and steady despite the tremor in her body. I am asking for a wage. I will earn it. Obed's jaw tightened further. He was a man accustomed to order, to having his world run according to his will. She was a disruption. The rational thing was to give her water and a piece of bread and point her toward town, which was another 20 miles to the east. He opened his mouth to do exactly that. The front door of the big house opened with a creak of hinges, and a little girl slipped out onto the porch. She was no older than 6, a miniature echo of the man standing in the yard. She had the same serious gray eyes, the same dark hair, but her face was pale, almost translucent, and her frame was delicate as a sparrow's. She clutched a worn corn-husk doll against her chest and watched the scene below with a solemn, silent intensity that belonged to a much older soul. Her gaze found Reva, and for a moment the child's expression softened with something the men's faces had not shown, a flicker of pure unburdened curiosity. Obed saw his daughter, and something in his heart expression shifted. It was not a softening. It was a subtle change in the tension around his mouth, a brief war between the man who wanted to protect his ordered world and the father who saw his child looking at a stranger with the first spark of interest she had shown in months. He looked at Reva, then at the vast empty land she had just crossed, and when he spoke, his voice was flat, stripped of any emotion. The laundry shed needs a new roof. The woodpile for the cookhouse is low. Boone will show you where to sleep. You will work for your keep until I decide if you are worth a wage. He turned and walked back toward the house without another word, and Boone stared after him with the expression of a man who has just watched his boss do something inexplicable. Obed had not offered her kindness. He had offered her a reprieve, temporary and conditional, a trial measured in labor and silence. For Reva, who had nothing, it was everything. She watched him go, a powerful man who moved like he was carrying a weight no one else could see, and she felt something stir in her chest. It was not quite fear and not quite hope, but a disquieting mix of both. Then her eyes went back to the porch, to the little girl, and she noticed something the men had not. The child's left sleeve was pulled down past her wrist, tugged low as if to hide something. When the girl shifted her doll to the other arm, the sleeve rode up for just a second, and Reva saw it. A bruise small and dark on the inside of her wrist. Not the bruise of a hand gripping too hard. The bruise of a body too frail, a child who fell too easily because something inside her was not right. Birdie Sedgewick was not healthy. Something was quietly, slowly wrong with her, and nobody in this house of men had noticed. Reva noticed, but she said nothing. She had no right to speak. Not yet. The place Boone showed her was not a room. It was a narrow, windowless space at the back of the tack room, smelling of leather and horse sweat and years of accumulated dust. There was a cot with a thin, lumpy mattress and a single wool blanket that carried the sharp scent of mothballs. A nail on the wall served as a hook for her bundle. That was all. It was more than she had slept on in weeks. She sank onto the cot and untied her bundle with trembling fingers, laying out her few possessions on the rough wool. A change of underthings worn thin and mended so many times the patches had patches. A small Bible with a cracked leather cover, its pages soft as cloth from use. And a leather pouch, supple and dark with age, filled with dried leaves and roots and seeds. She held the pouch against her chest and closed her eyes. It was her mother's legacy, the last physical thing she had of Desta Sutterly, who had known the names and natures of every green thing that grew. Yarrow for fever, willow bark for pain, plantain for wounds, comfrey for bones. The medicine of the earth passed from mother to daughter in whispered lessons on the porch of a cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains. A medicine that the world did not want. A medicine that made people afraid. She tucked the pouch under her mattress, lay down and stared at the dark ceiling. She did not cry. She had used up her tears somewhere on the road between the second town and the third, and what was left inside her was not grief, but something harder, a determination made of the same stuff as bone. She rose before dawn the next day and began to work. She stacked firewood until her arms screamed. She hauled buckets of water from the well until her palms blistered and bled, and then she wrapped them with strips torn from her spare underthings and hauled more. She did not complain. She did not slow down. She moved with a quiet, relentless determination that the ranch hands, at first suspicious and dismissive, began to notice. The cookhouse was Beulah Greer's kingdom, and Beulah guarded it with the ferocity of a bear guarding her den. She was a large woman, 50 years old, with arms like fence posts and a voice that could carry across a cattle drive. She had cooked for the Bar T for 11 years, since before the big house had glass windows, and she answered to no one except Obed Sedgewick, and even him she argued with when she felt like it. She met Reva on the first morning with her body blocking the cookhouse door and her hands planted on her hips. "I do not need help," Beulah said, her voice flat as a skillet. "I have cooked in this kitchen for 11 years, before the floors were level, before the stove had a proper flue. You step 1 foot in my kitchen, I will chase you out with a cast iron pan, and I am not joking." Reva looked at the older woman and saw something she recognized, a person whose only power in the world was a single room and the work she did in it. She understood that. She had been that person. "I am not here for your kitchen," Reva said quietly. "I would not take it from you." Beulah studied her for a long moment, her eyes narrowed, searching for the lie. Then she grunted and stepped aside, just enough for Reva to pass through to the long table where the hands ate their meals. That first supper told Reva everything she needed to know about her place on the Bar T. She sat at the far end of the long table, separated from the men by a stretch of empty bench. The food was good beef and beans and cornbread, but it was served to her on a chipped plate, while every other setting was whole. It was a small thing, a deliberate thing, Beulah's way of saying, "You are here, but you do not belong." Reva ate every bite, washed her own plate, and said nothing. The days folded into each other, each one a repetition of labor and silence. Obed Sedgewick ignored her with a thoroughness that felt intentional. He would ride past her on his gray gelding, his face set like stone, his gaze fixed on the far horizon, never once glancing in her direction. But she knew he was watching. She could feel his eyes on her back when she thought he had passed, a silent, constant assessment, as if he were waiting for her to fail. She learned about him in pieces from fragments of conversation she overheard, while the men thought she was too far away to hear. She learned that his wife Willala had died giving birth to Birdie 6 years ago. She learned that he had built the Bar T from nothing after the war, arriving with a small herd and a large ambition and a fury that he channeled into the land itself. He was respected by every man on the ranch. He was loved by none of them except perhaps the small, silent girl who shadowed his steps like a faithful ghost. She also heard another name, one that made the men lower their voices and shake their heads: Ansel Blackwood. He owned the ranch to the north, and he had been fighting with Obed over water rights for 2 years. The creek that fed the Bar T ran through Blackwood's land first, and Blackwood had twice dammed it to divert the flow onto his own pastures. Obed had twice torn the dams apart. The men spoke of it the way soldiers speak of a border skirmish, something that could turn into a war at any moment. Reva filed this information away and kept working. It was Birdie who first broke the wall of silence. The child appeared one afternoon while Reva was sitting on the back step of the cookhouse, trying to mend a tear in her dress with thread that was nearly the same color as the fabric. A shadow fell over her lap, and she looked up to find Birdie standing 2 feet away, holding out her corn husk doll. The doll's yarn hair had come undone, unraveling into a tangled mess. "Can you fix her?" Birdie whispered. Her voice was barely audible, as if she were afraid of being heard. Reva looked at the child's earnest face, at the serious gray eyes that were so much like her father's, but held none of his coldness, and she felt something crack open inside her chest. "I think so," she said. She took the doll gently and, with nimble fingers, rebraided the yarn, tying it securely with a bit of thread from her own mending kit. She added a small bow at the end, a tiny flourish that cost her nothing. She handed it back. Birdie looked at the doll, then up at Reva, and a small, rare smile touched her lips. It was a sunrise, that smile. It was the first warm thing Reva had seen since she arrived. "What is her name?" Reva asked. "Peg," Birdie said, and then in a rush of breath, as if she were saying something forbidden, "What is yours?" "Reva." "That is pretty," Birdie said, and then she turned and ran back into the house, clutching Peg against her chest, and the screen door banged shut behind her. From that day on, the child was Reva's silent companion. She would appear while Reva was working, settling nearby, like a bird on a fence post, watching with those big solemn eyes. She brought offerings: a smooth river stone the color of honey, a feather from a bluebird's wing, a perfect acorn cap. Tiny gestures of acceptance in a world that offered none. One afternoon, Birdie asked Reva the name of a yellow wildflower growing by the water trough. Reva told her it was Buttercup, and she told her that her mother had called it the Sunshine Cup, and for the first time since Sidon died, her own voice sounded soft to her ears. Birdie asked if Reva had children of her own. The question landed in Reva's chest like a stone dropped into a well. She was quiet for a long beat, feeling the silence ripple outward. "No," she said, "but I wish I did." Birdie reached out and took her hand, her small fingers curling around Reva's rough palm, and said nothing more. The gesture was so simple and so complete that Reva had to look away, blinking hard against the light. Obed watched these interactions from a distance, his expression unreadable as a shuttered window. He did not intervene. He did not encourage. He observed the way he observed everything on his ranch, with the careful measuring eye of a man who trusted nothing he had not built with his own hands. The shift came on an afternoon in late September when the light was turning gold, and the air carried the first hint of the cold to come. Reva was kneeling by the creek that ran along the southern edge of the property, washing dust from her face when she heard the uneven footsteps behind her. She turned and saw a man she had noticed, but never spoken to, an older ranch hand, perhaps 60, with a full head of white hair and a pronounced limp in his left leg. His name was Fenton Ashburn, and he had been on the bar T longer than anyone except Boone. He stood a few paces from her, his eyes not on her face but on her hands, more precisely on the leather pouch that had slipped from her pocket and lay open on the creek bank, its contents of dried leaves and roots visible in the afternoon light. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but there was something in it, a tremor that had nothing to do with age. Reva reached for the pouch, instinctively pulling it close. "It was my mother's." Fenton Ashburn's face changed. The weathered lines around his eyes deepened, and he took a step closer, staring at the pouch as if it were a ghost. "Your mother," he said slowly, "was her name Desta Sutterly." The name hit Reva like a thunderclap. No one had spoken her mother's name aloud since the day they buried her in the churchyard in Virginia 7 years ago. The sound of it in this stranger's mouth, here in this place at the edge of nowhere, was so unexpected that she could not speak. Fenton sat down on the creek bank heavily, as if his legs had given out. He rubbed his left knee, the one above the limp, and when he looked at her, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "I was infantry," he said. "Shiloh. Took a mini ball in the thigh, shattered the bone. The field surgeon wanted to take the leg, said it was the only way. But there was a woman, a civilian, she had come to the field hospital to help. She had a pouch just like that one. She packed the wound with something green, made me drink something so bitter I thought she was trying to poison me. I cursed her to her face. He paused, looking at the creek. 3 weeks later, I walked out of that hospital on 2 legs. The surgeon could not explain it. He called it a miracle. But it was not a miracle. It was Desta Sutterly. Reva's hands were shaking. She pressed them against the leather of the pouch, feeling the shapes of the dried herbs inside, and she felt her mother's presence so strongly it was as if the woman were standing behind her, one hand on her shoulder. "She was my mother," she said, and her voice broke on the last word. Fenton nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already known. "I owe her every step I have taken for the last 30 years. Every fence I have mended, every horse I have ridden, every morning I have stood up on 2 feet." He looked at Reva with an expression of fierce, quiet loyalty. "You have her hands. You have her pouch. I expect you have her knowledge, too." "Yes," Reva said. Fenton leaned forward and his voice dropped low. "Then listen to me carefully. Do not let anyone here know what you can do. Not Boone, not the men, and especially not Mr. Ashford. People in this part of the country, they fear what they do not understand, and what they fear they destroy." The warning settled into her like a cold stone. She had heard it before in the saloon keeper's wife's voice, in the word witch hissed at her back as she walked out of town. But hearing it here from a man who owed his leg to her mother's knowledge made it real in a way that frightened her. "I understand," she said. Fenton stood up, wincing as his knee took his weight. He looked down at her, and his expression softened into something that looked like the beginning of a promise. "If you ever need someone on your side," he said, "you come find me." He walked away, his limp, a reminder of a debt that had followed him across 30 years and 1,000 miles, and Reva sat by the creek holding her mother's pouch, feeling less alone than she had felt in months. 3 weeks after her arrival, the proving came. A young ranch hand named Poe, barely 20, reckless, and full of the bravado that comes from not yet understanding that the world can hurt you, was working the branding pen when a steer caught him wrong. The horn tore a deep, ugly gash in his left thigh, and the boy went down screaming in the dust, while the steer bellowed and the men shouted and scrambled to pull him free. They carried him to his bunk, a trail of blood marking the path across the yard like a dark accusation. The wound was bad, the flesh torn open to the Poe, and Poe's face was the color of old ash. Obed sent a man riding hard for town 20 miles east to fetch Dr. Bramwell. The doctor arrived in a cloud of dust and self-importance 3 hours later. He was a portly man with a florid face and small, soft hands that seemed to belong to a different profession entirely. He examined the wound, clucked his tongue, and went to work. He stitched the torn flesh with crude, uneven sutures, pouring whiskey directly into the open wound. Poe screamed so loudly that the horses in the far corral startled and kicked at their stalls. Bramwell prescribed laudanum for the pain, and bed rest, collected his fee from a grim-faced Obed, and departed with a confident pronouncement that the boy would be fine in a week. As Bramwell was finishing his work, he noticed Reva standing in the doorway of the bunkhouse. She was watching his hands, her expression still, but her eyes sharp, and something about the intensity of her gaze made him pause. "You have an opinion?" he asked, his voice carrying the edge of a man unaccustomed to being observed. Reva said nothing. Bramwell looked at Boone, who was standing nearby. "Who is she?" "Nobody," Boone said. "Does the laundry." Bramwell grunted, dismissed her from his mind, and climbed back into his buggy. But Reva had seen what she needed to see: the crude stitches, the whiskey poured into raw flesh, the total absence of cleanliness. She knew what was coming. By the following evening, the fever had set in. The wound was red and swollen, weeping a foul-smelling fluid that soaked through the bandages. Poe was delirious, muttering his mother's name and thrashing in his bunk. The men stood around him, helpless and grim. They had seen this before. They knew what blood poisoning looked like. They knew how it ended. Dr. Bramwell was summoned again. He rode out, looked at the wound, and shook his head with the practiced gravity of a man delivering news he did not have to live with. "The infection has taken hold," he declared. "There is nothing more I can do. Keep him comfortable. Pray." He collected a second fee and left. Reva stood at the door of the bunkhouse and watched him go. She could see the angry red streaks creeping up Poe's leg, the visible map of poison working its way toward his heart. She could hear his breathing, shallow and rapid, the sound of a body losing a fight, and something inside her. Something she had kept buried since the saloon keeper's wife called her a witch, refused to stay down any longer. She turned from the bunkhouse door and walked quickly across the yard to where Fenton Ashburn sat mending a bridle in the fading light. She knelt beside him. "I can save him," she said, "but I need someone to stand with me when I walk back in there." Fenton looked at her for a long moment. Then he set down the bridle and spoke, his voice low and steady. "If you save that boy, you will have a friend on this ranch for life. If he dies, though, they will blame you for it, and there will not be a thing I can do to stop them. He will die if I do nothing." Fenton nodded, the slow nod of a man who has weighed a thing and found it worth the risk. He stood up and together they walked back to the bunkhouse. Obed Sedgewick was standing just outside the door, staring into the gathering dark, his shoulders carrying the weight of responsibility for a boy dying under his roof. He turned as they approached. His face was a mask of cold fury and something raw underneath, something that looked like guilt. Reva stepped forward, holding a bowl of green, fragrant pulp she had prepared from the plantain leaves she had gathered at the creek in the yarrow she had found growing in a patch of sun near the fence line. "Let me help him," she said. "This will draw out the poison. The tea will break the fever." Obed stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "You, with a handful of weeds. A doctor has already said there is nothing to be done." That doctor did not clean the wound. He poured whiskey into open flesh, which burns the tissue and seals the infection inside. He did not heal that boy. He sealed his fate. The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water. She had said it plainly, without anger, without pleading, a simple statement of fact delivered with a certainty that was more unsettling than any argument. Boone appeared in the doorway behind Obed. "What is she talking about?" "She thinks she is a doctor," Obed said, his voice heavy with scorn. "The earth is a doctor," Reva replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "If you know how to listen. That boy is dying. Your doctor has given up on him. What harm can I do now?" Her logic was a cold, hard thing. It cut through Obed's pride and his skepticism and his need to control every outcome on his land. He looked from her face to the dark doorway where Poe's ragged breathing filled the silence. He looked at Fenton, standing quietly behind her, the old man's presence, a wordless endorsement. Obed Sedgewick had built this ranch by trusting his instincts, and his instincts were telling him two things at once. That this woman was a stranger with a bowl of crushed leaves who had no business touching one of his men, and that the boy inside was going to die before morning if someone did not do something different. He gave a sharp, bitter nod. "Do what you can, but if he is worse for it, you will answer to me." Reva stepped through the doorway, and every eye in the bunkhouse turned to watch her walk toward the bed, where Poe lay burning with fever, his skin the color of tallow, his breath a thin whistle through cracked lips. She carried the bowl of crushed plantain in one hand and a pot of bitter yarrow tea in the other, and her hands were perfectly steady. The men parted to let her through, their faces caught between doubt and the desperate hope of people who have run out of options. Behind her, Fenton Ashburn stepped into the bunkhouse and leaned against the wall by the door. His arms crossed, his presence a quiet declaration. Outside, Obed Sedgewick stood alone in the dark, listening to the sounds from within, and he did not move from that spot for a very long time. She worked through the night with the focus of a woman who understood that failure was not a word she could afford. The bunkhouse was hot and close, smelling of sweat and sickness, and the sharp green scent of the poultice she had packed into the wound. She changed it every 2 hours, pulling away the cloth to find it dark with what the boy's body was expelling, and each time the angry color around the gash retreated a little further. She lifted Poe's head and coaxed the bitter tea past his cracked lips, a spoonful at a time, patient as gravity. The ranch hands drifted in and out, watching from the doorway, not speaking. Fenton stayed by the wall, a silent sentinel, and Obed stood outside in the dark, leaning against the bunkhouse frame, his arms crossed, listening to every sound from within. He watched through the open door as Reva's hands moved with a sureness that was beyond confidence. It was knowledge so deep it had become instinct, the way a river knows where to flow. He saw her touch the boy's forehead with the back of her fingers, gentle as a mother checking a sleeping child. He saw her lean close to listen to his breathing, adjusting the angle of his head to ease the passage of air. There was no hesitation in any of it, no theater, no performance, just work careful and complete. It unsettled him in a way he could not name. Just before dawn, the change came. Poe's skin, which had been dry and burning, broke into a heavy sweat. His breathing slowed from its frantic, shallow rhythm into something deeper, more regular, the sound of a body that had stopped fighting and started healing. He fell into a true sleep, his face slack, his hands unclenching for the first time in 2 days. When Reva emerged from the bunkhouse into the gray light of early morning, her face was pale with exhaustion, and her dress was stained with the work of the night. Obed was still there. He held a tin cup of coffee in his hands, and when he looked at her, his eyes held something she had not seen before. Not warmth, not gratitude. Something harder to name and harder to give. A recognition that she had done a thing he could not, and that the doing of it had changed the shape of something inside his chest. He said nothing. He extended the cup toward her. She took it, and their fingers did not touch, and the distance between them felt deliberate and necessary, like the space between a match and dry kindling. She drank the coffee standing up, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. In the days that followed, the ranch shifted around Reva, the way land shifts after a flood, subtly, permanently, in ways that only become visible later. The men began calling her Mrs. Reva, their voices carrying a new weight. They brought her their small injuries, a rope burn on a palm, a splinter driven deep under a thumbnail, a shoulder wrenched from wrestling a calf, and she treated them with quiet efficiency. Nobody used the word healer. Nobody needed to. Obed gave her the small room in the main house that had been meant for a governess he had never hired. It had a window that looked out over the rolling hills to the south, and the first time she stood at that window and watched the light change across the land, she felt something shift inside her, a settling like a stone finding its place at the bottom of a creek. He began paying her a wage. Every Saturday she would find coins on her dresser, left without ceremony or explanation, as if they had simply appeared there by some natural law. She never saw him place them. She understood that this was how he spoke, not with words but with acts, small and deliberate, each one an admission he would never make out loud. One evening she was grinding dried chamomile in the kitchen, long after Beulah had gone to bed. A single candle on the table threw her shadow large against the wall. She heard his boots on the floorboard before she saw him, and she looked up as he entered, her hands going still on the mortar. "I could not sleep," she said. He walked to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee. He brought one to her, and this time when he handed it over, his fingers brushed against hers. A brief, accidental collision of skin that sent something sharp and electric through both of them. They pulled apart as if scalded, and the small kitchen suddenly felt too small. He leaned against the counter and created a careful distance between them. Arms crossed, eyes on the floor. "You have been good for Birdie," he said. The words came out stiff as if they had been stored too long and had dried out. "She is a wonderful child," Reva replied, her eyes on her cup. "She just needed someone to see her." The silence that followed was louder than the words. They both knew she was not only talking about the girl. He cleared his throat. "The men respect you, even Boone. I think they were just relieved I did not poison Poe." He almost smiled. Almost. It was the ghost of an expression there and gone. But she saw it, and it changed the geometry of his face in a way that made her chest tighten. Then he said something she did not expect. "You know how to find water. You know how to heal a wound. You stood in the middle of my ranch with nothing but a worn-out dress and a bag of leaves, and you did what a trained physician could not do." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I want to ask you where you came from, but if I ask, you will ask me something back that I am not ready to answer." Reva looked at him at the hard line of his jaw and the shadows under his eyes. "Then we both keep our doors closed," she said. He nodded once, finished his coffee in silence, and left her there in the candlelight, the scent of crushed chamomile and something unspoken hanging in the warm air between the place where he had stood and the place where she remained. The trouble with Ansel Blackwood had been simmering for 2 years, like a pot left too long on a stove. It boiled over on a Tuesday in October. Obed rode out at dawn to check the south pasture and found the creek running thin, barely a trickle over stones that should have been submerged. He followed the creek bed north for 3 miles, his jaw tightening with every step his horse took, until he reached the boundary of his land and saw what Blackwood had done. The dam was twice the size of the previous ones. Blackwood had brought in hired men, not ranch hands, but laborers from town, and they had built a wall of earth and timber across the creek that was solid enough to last through winter. Behind it, a pond was forming on Blackwood's side, the water that belonged to the Bartees' cattle pooling in stolen abundance. Blackwood himself was sitting on his horse on the far bank watching Obed approach with a grin that showed too many teeth. "Morning, Ashford. You know what you have done," Obed said. His voice was level controlled, but there was a vibration underneath it, a wire pulled tight. "I know I have improved my property," Blackwood said. He was a thick man, shorter than Obed by half a head, with the cunning eyes of a person who measured every interaction by what he could take from it. "Water flows through my land first. I have got a right to use it. Natural flow doctrine says you do not have the right to divert it. You know that. I know that. The territorial court knows that." Blackwood's grin widened. "Courts are in Helena. That is a long ride. By the time a judge sees your complaint, your cattle will be drinking dust." He was right, and they both knew it. The law was a distant thing on the frontier, slow as winter and just as cold. Justice was measured in months, and thirst was measured in days. Obed looked at the dam, then at the hired men standing along the bank. 5 of them, each carrying a rifle with the casual ease of men who had been told to use them if necessary. He could tear this dam apart with his bare hands, and a team of horses, but not without a fight, and a fight meant blood, and blood meant the possibility that he would not ride home to the daughter who was waiting for him on the porch. He turned his horse and rode back to the Bartee without a word. And when he arrived, the men saw something in his face that made them step out of his way. He dismounted, walked past the corral, and drove his fist into the corner post of the fence so hard that the wood cracked and his knuckles split open. Boone found him there, staring at his bleeding hand as if it belonged to someone else. "We can ride up there tonight," Boone said quietly. 6 men, tear it down in the dark. He has 5 rifles on that bank. Then we bring 6. And if one of my men takes a bullet, what do I tell his family? Obed's voice was raw. "I am not losing a man over a creek." He was trapped, and the trap was one he understood in his bones. It was the same trap the war had taught him, the moment when doing the right thing and doing the safe thing pull in opposite directions, and a man has to choose which part of himself to sacrifice. Reva heard about the dam from Fenton that evening. She listened without interruption, her face still, her mind working. After Fenton finished, she asked him one question. How far upstream does Barty land extend past the house? Fenton told her and she nodded, and the next morning before the sun cleared the horizon, she was walking the dry creek bed alone, her eyes on the ground. Her mother had not only taught her the names of plants. Desta Sutterly had grown up in the hollows of Appalachia, where water was life, and finding it was a skill passed down like language. You did not need a divining rod or a prayer. You needed your eyes. You looked for the places where the earth was telling you what was underneath the dark green band of vegetation, in a field of dry grass, the particular lean of certain trees, whose roots reached deep for moisture, the faint depression in the ground, where an underground channel pushes the surface downward by an inch. Reva found it half a mile east of the main house, a strip of grass so green it looked painted against the brown October prairie. She borrowed a shovel from the tool shed and started digging, and at a depth of less than 4 feet, the bottom of the hole turned dark, then wet, then began to fill. She straightened up, breathing hard, and looked at the water seeping up through the earth, and she felt her mother's presence again. Not as memory, but as something alive, as if Desta Sutterly were standing beside her, one hand on the shovel, saying, "There it is, child, I told you the earth provides." She went to find Fenton. Fenton came, looked at the waters, tested the soil, and confirmed what she had found. Then they went together to find Obed. He was in the barn repairing a harness with hands that still bore the scabs from the fence post. Fenton spoke first because he understood that what they were about to say would be easier for Obed to hear from a man he had known for years. "Mrs. Reva found something you need to see." Obed followed them to the dig site in silence, his face closed and skeptical. He stood at the edge of the hole and looked down at the water that was pooling at the bottom, clear and cold, rising slowly from the ground. He looked at Reva. "How did you know this was here?" "The grass told me," she said simply. "Where it stays green when everything else turns brown, there is water underneath." He stared at her, and she could see the calculation happening behind his gray eyes. A well here would give the Barty its own water source, independent of the creek, independent of Blackwood. The dam upstream would become irrelevant, a wall holding back water that nobody needed anymore. He turned to Boone, who had followed them out of curiosity, and his voice was the voice of a man who has just found a weapon he did not know he had. "Get a crew on this. I want a proper well dug by the end of the week." He did not thank Reva. He did not speak to her again that day. But that evening, when she returned to her room after supper, there was a pair of boots sitting on the floor by her bed. New boots, women's boots, good leather, thick soles. They were exactly her size. There was no note. She sat on the bed and held them in her lap, running her fingers over the stitching, and she understood what they meant. Not "I am grateful," not "you are valuable." Something harder to say, something closer to "I see you." She put them on and they fit perfectly, and for the first time in months, the ground beneath her felt solid. Ansel Blackwood did not take the loss quietly. 3 nights after the well was finished, Reva woke to the smell of smoke. She was at the window before she was fully conscious, and what she saw drove the sleep from her body in an instant. The eastern fence line was burning, a ribbon of orange fire crawling along the dry timber in the darkness. Beyond the flames, she could hear cattle bellowing in panic, the heavy drumming of hooves on hard ground. She did not think, she ran. By the time she reached the yard, the men were already pouring out of the bunkhouse, pulling on boots, grabbing buckets. Boone was shouting orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. Fenton was limping toward the horse corral, his face grim. Obed was already mounted, riding toward the fire, silhouetted against the glow. Reva grabbed a burlap sack from the pile by the water trough, soaked it, and ran toward the nearest section of burning fens. The heat pushed against her face like a physical hand, But she swung the wet sack at the base of the flames, beating them down into hissing smoke. Beside her, two ranch hands were doing the same thing. Behind her, Beulah Greer came out of the cookhouse carrying a pot of water in each hand, her nightgown billowing, and threw them on the flames nearest the kitchen wall. It took an hour to beat the fire down. When it was over, 200 yards of fencing was charred ruin, and a section of the cattle had scattered into the dark prairie. No one was hurt. No buildings were lost. But the message was clear. Obed found Reva by the smoldering fence line, her face black with soot. Her new boots scuffed the wet sack still in her hands. She was breathing hard, her eyes bright in the reflected glow of dying embers. "Get inside," he said. "It is not safe." She looked at him and her voice came out steady and certain. "I live here. This is my home too." The words stopped him. He looked at her, standing in the smoke and ash, and something crossed his face that was not the controlled assessment she was accustomed to seeing. It was surprise. It was recognition. And underneath both something warmer, something that scared him far more than the fire. He said nothing. He turned his horse and rode out into the dark to find his scattered cattle, and Reva stood in the ruined fence line and watched him go, and she realized that what she had said was true. Somewhere between the chipped plate and the new boots between the creek bank and the well, she had stopped being a visitor. This was her home. The next morning, Obed rode to Blackwood's ranch with Boone and 3 armed men. There was no violence. Obed sat on his horse in Blackwood's yard and spoke 6 sentences in a voice so quiet that Blackwood had to lean forward to hear them. Nobody ever learned exactly what he said. But Boone later told Fenton that when Obed finished talking, Blackwood's face was the color of old milk and the hired men with rifles were nowhere to be seen. Beulah Greer's war against Reva ended on a cold night in late October. Not with a surrender, but with a back spasm that put the older woman flat on the kitchen floor. Reva heard the crash of a dropped pan and found Beulah lying face down on the stone, her breath coming in short, pained gasps, her hands clawing at the floor. The nearest doctor was 20 miles away, and the night was black and cold. Reva did not ask permission. She heated water, steeped it with dried herbs, and used it to soak cloth compresses that she pressed against Beulah's lower back. She worked her hands into the knotted muscles along the older woman's spine, slow and firm, finding the places where the spasm had locked the tissue into rigid cords and coaxing them to release. She talked Beulah through, breathing slow and slow out, counting the seconds between each breath. After an hour, Beulah sat up. The pain had retreated from unbearable to merely bad, and there were tears on her cheeks, though Reva pretended not to see them. "The plate," Beulah said, her voice rough. "The chipped one. I am sorry about that." Reva took her hand. "I know." From that night forward, the geography of the cookhouse changed. A corner of the kitchen counter was cleared, and jars of dried herbs appeared on it, neatly labeled in Reva's careful handwriting. When ranch hands came looking for a remedy for a sore back or a stubborn cough, it was Beulah who pointed them to Reva's corner with a jerk of her chin and a gruff, "She is in the garden." Reva had planted that garden behind the cookhouse in September, tucking seeds and cuttings into a patch of earth she had cleared herself. By November, the first green shoots were pushing through the soil, small and defiant against the coming cold. It was her own piece of ground, the first she had ever had, and she tended it with a devotion that went beyond practicality. It was proof that she existed here, that she belonged. The cold came early that year, a bitter wind off the northern plains that cut through wool and leather and settled into the bones of everyone on the Bartee. It started with the ranch hands. A cough here, a fever there, the kind of seasonal illness that sweeps through close quarters like wind through grass. Then it spread to the town. Dr. Bramwell was busy riding his buggy from one sick bed to another, dispensing his tonics and his grave pronouncements and accomplishing very little. Reva treated the men on the ranch with teas and compresses, and most of them recovered within days. She said nothing about it to Obed. She did not need to. He saw the men returning to work while the town's sick lingered, and his gray eyes tracked her movements across the ranch with an attention he no longer tried to disguise. And then the sickness came for Birdie. It began as a small cough, a dry, tight sound that Reva heard across the kitchen table one morning and felt in her spine like a warning bell. She knew that sound. She knew what it meant in a child whose body was already running on thin reserves, a child who bruised too easily and tired too quickly, and whose pale skin told a story that no one in this house of men had thought to read. Within a day, the fever began. It climbed fast, faster than it should have in a child so young. Birdie lay in her bed in the upstairs room, her dark hair spread on the pillow, her cheeks flushed with the heat that Reva could feel from the doorway. Her breathing was shallow and tight, each inhale a small battle, each exhale a concession. Obed became a man Reva had not seen before. The iron control that defined him, the calm authority that held his ranch and his men and his grief in perfect order began to crack. He paced the hallway outside Birdie's room, his boots marking a path in the wooden floor. He stood at the window and stared at nothing. His face was not angry. It was terrified, and the terror was worse than any fury because he had no enemy to fight and no order to give that could fix what was happening. He sent for Bramwell immediately. The doctor came, examined Birdie, and prescribed the same syrups he always prescribed. "It is the seasonal affliction," he said, adjusting his spectacles with an air of practiced authority. "She is a delicate child. We must keep her warm and wait for it to pass." It did not pass. The fever climbed. Birdie's breathing became a rasping struggle, each breath sounding like it was being dragged through wet gravel. Reva prepared teas of mullein and horehound and kept them warm on the kitchen stove. She did not bring them upstairs. She did not offer them. She stood in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around a cup she was not drinking, and she waited because this was not her decision to make. This was his child, his grief, his choice. One night, the crisis came to a head. Birdie was delirious, calling for her father in a voice that was barely a whisper. Dr. Bramwell had been and gone for the third time, shaking his head and invoking the will of God with an ease that made Reva's hands tremble, with an anger she could not afford to show. Obed sat by his daughter's bed. He had not eaten in 2 days. His shirt was wrinkled, his jaw unshaven, his eyes hollow. He was a man watching the same nightmare unfold for the second time, knowing the ending, powerless to change it. The memory lived inside him like a second heartbeat. Willa's cough, Willa's fever, the same progression, the same helpless, waiting, the same useless doctor, saying the same useless words. And at the end of it, Willa's hand going cold in his, while a newborn screamed in the next room. He had held both of them that night, the dead and the living one in each hand, and he had made a choice to keep going, to build and work and wall off every vulnerable thing inside himself so that nothing could ever reach him again. Now the walls were coming down, and behind them was nothing but a man who was afraid. Reva appeared in the doorway of Birdie's room. She held a steaming mug. "You need to keep your strength," she said softly, placing it on the bedside table. He did not look at it. His eyes were fixed on Birdie's flushed face, on the small chest rising and falling with each labored breath. "He said there is nothing more to be done," he whispered. The same words, the exact same words they said about Willa. Reva felt something break inside her, not for herself, but for him. For the man who had built a fortress out of timber and will and silence, and was watching it crumble around a child's bed. She reached out, a hesitant, instinctive gesture, and placed her hand on his shoulder. He flinched. Every fiber of his body recoiled from the contact, a lifetime of guardedness snapping taut like a tripwire. But then her warmth came through the fabric of his shirt, steady and certain, and something in him yielded. He leaned into her hand for a fraction of a second, a tilt so slight that anyone watching might have missed it. But Reva felt it. She felt the entire weight of his resistance shift just for a heartbeat onto her palm. Then he pulled away, straightening, and the mask of control locked back into place. But the moment had happened. The wall between them had been breached, and both of them knew it could not be unbreached. He looked at her with eyes that were no longer cold, but raw, stripped, desperate. "Help her," he said. It was not a command. It was the most honest sound she had ever heard him make. But before Reva could move, before she could gather her herbs and her courage and go to work, the sound of horses in the yard below froze them both. Dr. Bramwell had not gone home after his last visit. He had gone to town, and he had done something far more dangerous than prescribing useless medicine. He had talked. The stories had been building for weeks, whispered in the general store, and the saloon carried from mouth to mouth like embers in dry grass. The widow at the bar tea who had saved the gored ranch hand. The woman who grew strange plants behind the cookhouse and mixed potions in the kitchen at night. Bramwell had fed those stories with the careful precision of a man protecting his livelihood. He spoke of folk magic. He spoke of dangerous, ungodly practices. He suggested, never quite stating, but always implying that what Reva did was something darker than medicine. And he found a willing ally in Reverend Rowan Fairchild. Fairchild was a tall, gaunt man with a voice built for pulpits and a conviction that bent the world to fit his beliefs rather than the other way around. He was not a charlatan. He was something more dangerous. He was sincere. 10 years ago, a child in his congregation had died after drinking a tincture prepared by a traveling herbalist, and the memory of that small coffin had burned itself into his faith like a brand. He believed with the absolute certainty of a man who has witnessed the worst possible outcome that folk medicine was the devil's handshake. When Bramwell came to him with stories of the woman at the bar, Fairchild did not hesitate. The sheriff arrived at the ranch the next morning with Bramwell and Fairchild flanking him like mismatched bookends. Bramwell wore a smug expression. Fairchild carried a Bible. Obed met them on the porch, Birdie's labored breathing audible through the open window above. "Mr. Sedgewick," the sheriff began, looking uncomfortable. He was a reasonable man caught between unreasonable forces. "Dr. Bramwell has lodged a complaint. He says this woman you have working here is practicing medicine without a license, that she is a danger." Obed's face went hard. He looked from Bramwell's satisfied smirk to Fairchild's rigid jaw to the sheriff's uneasy eyes. "This woman saved one of my men when this doctor left him to die," Obed said. His voice was low, controlled, and underneath it, lethal. "Now my daughter is sick, and he has failed her too." "It is God's will," Fairchild said, stepping forward. His voice carried the practiced resonance of 1,000 sermons. "I have seen a child die from these backwoods remedies, Mr. Ashford. A boy named Ephraim Cole, 7 years old, dead in his mother's arms, because a woman just like this one gave him a poison she called medicine. I will not stand by and watch it happen again." The name hit the air and stayed there. Ephraim Cole, a dead child, a real child with a real grave in a real churchyard. Fairchild was not lying. He was not performing. He was remembering, and the pain in his voice was genuine, and it was that genuineness that made his accusations so devastating. Obed looked at Reva, who had come to the porch, and his face was a map of a man being torn in half. On one side stood the established world, the doctor with his diploma, the preacher with his Bible, the sheriff with his badge. On the other stood a woman with a leather pouch and a knowledge he did not understand. The fear for Birdie was a living thing inside him, enormous and suffocating, and it told him a simple, terrible lie. The safe choice is the known choice. The familiar failure is better than the unknown risk. "Stay away from my daughter," he said to Reva, and the words came out of him like something torn from living wood. Until the sheriff has sorted this out. The look on Reva's face was not anger. Anger would have been easier to bear. What he saw was a wound opening, a deep and quiet devastation that went beyond hurt into something that looked like the death of a small, carefully tended hope. She had trusted him. She had planted a garden on his land and called it home. She had laid her hand on his shoulder and felt him lean into it, and she had believed against every lesson the world had taught her that this time would be different. She turned without a word and walked into the house. That evening in her small room, Reva packed her belongings into the bundle tied with twine. The Bible, the copper ring, the leather pouch. She folded her spare clothes and placed them on top. She set the new boots beside the bed because they had been given to her by a man who no longer trusted her, and wearing them felt like wearing a lie. She would leave at dawn. The 40 miles she had walked to reach this place were nothing compared to the distance she would have to cross now, with no destination ahead and a broken faith behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her, the creak of timber, the whisper of wind against the window, and from the room down the hall through the thin walls, the sound of a child's breathing growing weaker. Each inhale a little shallower, each exhale a little longer, the space between them stretching like a thread about to snap. Reva closed her eyes and pressed her mother's pouch against her chest, and the war inside her was the oldest war she knew. The one between the part of her that wanted to save and the part that had learned again and again that saving was not enough if no one let you try. From Birdie's room, the breathing hitched, stopped. 1 second of absolute silence that filled the entire house like a held breath. Then a small, strangled gasp, the sound of a life catching itself at the very edge. Reva's eyes opened in the dark. Her hands were still on the bundle. That night was the longest of Obed Sedgewick's life. He sat in the chair beside Birdie's bed, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed, listening to the sound of his daughter's breathing the way a man listens to a clock counting down to something he cannot stop. Each inhale was a thin, wet rattle. Each exhale was a whisper that seemed to carry less air than the one before. The pauses between them grew longer, and in those pauses the silence pressed against his eardrums until he could hear his own heartbeat, heavy and useless. The sheriff had gone, Bramwell had gone, Fairchild had gone. They had taken their complaint and their righteousness and their Bible and driven away into the dark, and Obed was alone with his dying daughter and the wreckage of his own judgment. He had chosen the safe path. He had chosen the doctor and the preacher and the badge, the architecture of the world. He understood the order he had spent his whole life building, and that order was killing his child. He thought of the woman down the hall. He thought of her hands on Poe's wounds, sure and steady. He thought of the water rising from the ground where she said it would be. He thought of her standing in the smoke of the burning fence soot on her face, telling him this was her home. He thought of her hand on his shoulder, the warmth of it, and how he had leaned into it for one unguarded second before pulling away. He had sent her away. He had looked into her face and chosen the man who had failed him over the woman who had not, and the expression he had put on her face was something he would carry for the rest of his life. Whether that life lasted another 40 years or ended tonight in this room with the sound of his daughter's breathing. Near midnight, the breathing changed. Birdie inhaled a shallow scraping sound, and then there was nothing. No exhale, no movement. The small chest under the quilt was still. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The silence was absolute, a void where his daughter's life had been, and Obed felt the floor tilt beneath him as if the earth itself were opening. Then a tiny choked gasp, a spasm of air forced through a throat that was closing. Birdie's body arched on the bed, then went limp, and the breathing resumed, but thinner now, more fragile, a thread being pulled through a needle's eye. Obed was on his feet before he knew he had moved. He was in the hallway, his boots loud on the wooden floor, and he was at her door, and he did not knock. He threw it open and stood in the frame, breathing hard, his hands gripping the door jamb, as if it were the only thing holding him upright. Reva was sitting on the edge of the bed in a square of moonlight. Her bundle was at her feet, tanned and ready. The new boots sat beside the bed where she had left them. She was wearing the old ones, the ones with the ruined soles, because she had decided that the road ahead did not deserve good leather. She looked up at him, and her eyes were dry and dark, and the sorrow in them was not for herself. "She is worse," he said. The words came out broken, cracked down the middle. "I was wrong. I was a fool." He stopped in front of her. The great Obed Sedgewick, the man who had clawed a ranch out of the wilderness with his bare hands. The man whose orders were obeyed without question across 5,000 acres. He stood before a penniless widow in a moonlit room, and every wall he had built, every defense he had constructed, every silence he had used as armor came apart at once, and what was left was just a father who was losing his child. "Please," he said, and his voice broke on the word like a wave breaking on rock. "Do not leave. Help her. I am begging you." Reva looked at his face. She saw the fear carved into every line, the regret that burned behind his eyes, the total collapse of the pride that had defined him for as long as she had known him. She saw a man who had wronged her standing in her doorway, asking for the one thing she had always been willing to give, and being turned away from it was the one thing she could not do. This was not about pride. It was not about being proven right. It was about a 6-year-old girl with gray eyes and a cornhusk doll named Peg, a girl who brought feathers and river stones as gifts, a girl whose small hand had curled around Reva's palm one afternoon in the sun and held on. She stood up. The bundle slid from the bed to the floor and lay there forgotten, a small monument to a departure that would not happen. "Get me fresh water, boiled," she said, and her voice was suddenly sharp, clear, a blade drawn from a sheath. "All the water Beulah can heat and build up the fire in the stove. I need the kitchen hot enough to make steam." He did not hesitate. He ran. Obed Sedgewick ran down the stairs of his own house, taking them two at a time, and burst into the kitchen where Beulah Greer was sitting at the table in her nightgown, unable to sleep, her hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. She looked up at his face and understood everything without a word being spoken. She was on her feet and reaching for the kettle before he finished his first sentence. Upstairs, Reva moved with the precision of someone whose body remembered what to do even when her mind was racing. She opened her leather pouch and laid its contents on the bedside table. This was different from treating Poe. That had been a wound, an invasion of the flesh, a battle fought on the surface of the body. This was deeper. This was in the lungs, in the air itself, and it required different weapons. She selected the dried root of elecampane, thick and knotted, and began to shave it into thin slices with a small knife. She crushed dried thyme between her palms, releasing its sharp, clean scent. She found the last of her eucalyptus leaves, brittle and precious, saved for an emergency she had always known would come. Obed returned with a kettle of boiling water and a face that was ready to follow any instruction she gave. Together they poured the water into a basin and set it on a chair beside Birdie's bed. Reva dropped the thyme and eucalyptus into the steaming water, and the room filled immediately with a scent that was sharp and green and alive, cutting through the heavy air of sickness like a clean wind. She pulled the sheet from the foot of the bed and draped it over the headboard in the chair, creating a low tent that trapped the rising steam around Birdie's head. The child's breathing, still thin and labored, began to catch the vapor, pulling it in with each inhale. "Hold the sheet," Reva said, and Obed held it, his large hands gripping the cotton, his eyes on his daughter's face through the gap in the fabric, watching for any sign of change. Reva went back to the kitchen and brewed the Ella Campani root into a dark, bitter tea. She strained it through clean cloth and added a spoonful of honey, the only sweetness she could offer against the taste. She carried it upstairs and, sitting on the edge of the bed, lifted Birdie's head with one hand and brought the cup to the child's lips with the other. "Drink, sweetheart," she whispered. "Just a little. That is all I need." Birdie's eyes were closed, her consciousness somewhere far away, but the instinct to swallow was still there. A small amount of the tea went down, then a little more. Reva was patient. She did not rush. She held the child's head as gently as she would hold something made of glass, and she waited between each sip, and Obed watched her from the other side of the bed, holding the sheet, holding the steam, holding his breath. At 2 in the morning, there was a sound at the door. Fenton Ashburn stood in the hallway, his white hair disheveled, his coat thrown over his nightclothes. In his hand was a bundle of fresh thyme, the leaves still wet with dew. He had gone out into the cold dark and cut it from the patch that grew along the south wall of the barn, working by feel because the moon was behind clouds. He did not enter the room. He handed the thyme to Reva, and their eyes met, and in that exchange was everything that did not need to be said. The knowledge that had saved his leg 30 years ago was in this room tonight, working through different hands on a different body, and the chain of it, mother to daughter, battlefield to bedroom, was unbroken. Fenton nodded once and went back down the stairs. An hour later, Beulah appeared carrying a pot of thin broth and a look on her face that Reva had never seen before. The toughness was still there, the granite jaw and the sharp eyes, but underneath it was something raw and undefended. "I have watched that child grow since she was small enough to fit in a bread basket," Beulah said. Her voice was rough, and she did not try to smooth it. "You do what needs doing." She set the broth down and left, and Reva heard her footsteps retreat down the hall, and then faintly the sound of a door closing and a woman crying alone in a kitchen. The hours crawled. Reva changed the water in the basin twice, adding fresh herbs each time. She administered the tea in small doses, never more than a few sips, watching Birdie's face for any reaction. Obed held the lamp when she needed light, and held the sheet when she needed steam, and held his silence when she needed quiet. And they worked side by side through the darkest hours with a coordination that required no words, as if they had been doing this together for years instead of hours. At 4 in the morning, the fever had not broken, and Reva felt the cold hand of doubt close around her heart. She was kneeling beside the bed, her hand on Birdie's forehead, feeling the heat that would not recede, and for the first time her hands trembled. The sureness that had carried her through every crisis, the knowledge that was her mother's gift and her mother's burden, wavered. She thought of Ephraim Cole, the child Fairchild had spoken of, the boy who had died. She thought of every person who had called her a witch, and she wondered in the worst possible moment if they were right, if the line between healing and harm was thinner than she believed. If her hands, so sure on Poe's wound, so confident at Beulah's back, were reaching beyond their right. Obed saw her hands shake. He saw the doubt cross her face like a cloud crossing the moon, and he recognized it because he had lived inside that doubt for years. The fear of making the wrong choice. The terror of trusting yourself and being wrong. He reached across the bed and placed his hand over hers. His palm was rough and warm, and it covered her smaller hand, completely steadying it the way a dock steadies a boat in rough water. "I trust you," he said. 3 words. Ordinary words, the kind spoken 1,000 times a day in 1,000 ordinary rooms. But in this room at this hour from this man, they were not ordinary. They were the first true thing Obed Sedgewick had said to another human being in 6 years. He had not said them to his foreman or his men or his dead wife's memory. He said them to a woman kneeling beside his daughter's bed, with trembling hands and a bag of dried roots, and he meant them with every broken piece of himself. Reva's hand stopped shaking. She adjusted the steam tent, adding the fresh thyme Fenton had brought. She increased the concentration of the tea, steeping the elecampane longer, making it darker, stronger. She spooned it into Birdie's mouth with a steadiness that came from somewhere deeper than skill, from the place where her mother's voice lived quiet and certain, saying the words she had heard 1,000 times. Listen to the body, child. It knows how to heal. You just have to help it remember. The first light of dawn came slowly, the way mercy comes without announcement, spreading across the floor in thin gold lines that found the foot of the bed and climbed the quilt and reached Birdie's face. The change arrived with the light. The rasping sound that had filled the room for 2 days softened. The wet, grating quality of each breath smoothed out, replaced by something deeper, cleaner. The sound of air moving through passages that were opening, clearing, releasing what had been trapped. Birdie's breathing found a rhythm, slow and steady, the rhythm of sleep rather than struggle. Then she coughed, a deep, productive cough that shook her small frame and brought color to her cheeks and cleared the sickness from her chest in a single violent expulsion. And then another, and then she was still, and her breathing was even, and the fever that had burned for days was receding like a tide pulling back from shore. Her eyes opened. They were gray like her father's, but where his had been hard and closed for years, hers were clear and soft, and full of the simple wonder of a child waking up in a room where two people she loved were watching over her. She looked at her father, she looked at Reva, and a tiny sleepy smile touched her lips. Peg fell off the bed, she whispered. Obed made a sound. It was not a word. It was something older than language, a sound dragged up from the deepest part of him, and it broke the dam he had built inside himself 6 years ago, on the night his wife died and his daughter was born. He sank into the chair and buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook, and the sobs that came out of him were silent and enormous. The grief he had never allowed himself for Willa, the terror he had just survived for Birdie, the shame of what he had done to Reva, all of it pouring out at once in a flood that had been building behind his walls for so long that its release felt like a second birth. Reva stood beside him. She placed her hand on his back between his shoulder blades, and she held it there steady and warm, and she did not speak. She let him break because she knew that breaking was not the same as being destroyed. Sometimes it was the only way to become whole. Birdie fell back to sleep, holding Peg, and the room was quiet and the morning light was gold. The sheriff returned 3 hours later with Dr. Bramwell and Reverend Fairchild trailing behind him. They found Obed on the front porch, sitting in one of the 2 rocking chairs with Birdie in his lap, the child wrapped in a wool blanket, her head against his chest, her breathing easy and deep. The color had returned to her face, a warm pink that was visible even from the yard. Dr. Bramwell stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, and his mouth opened, and nothing came out. Before Obed spoke, the porch filled behind him. Fenton Ashburn stepped around the corner of the house, his arms at his sides, his face calm and resolute. Beulah Greer appeared in the front doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, her jaw set. And Boone, who had watched Reva arrive at this ranch with suspicion and a story about a poison-selling woman, walked out of the barn and stood at the base of the porch steps with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his eyes fixed on the doctor. Nobody said a word. Nobody needed to. The message was written in their positions, in their stillness, in the way they had arranged themselves around the man in the chair and the child in his arms. This ranch stood together. Obed looked at Bramwell, and his eyes were clear, washed clean by the night's tears, and as cold and certain as winter sky. Mrs. Reva did what you could not, he said, His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a man who has walked through the worst night of his life and come out the other side knowing exactly what he believes. She used her knowledge and her care, and she saved my daughter's life. Your services are no longer required on this ranch or in this territory if I have anything to say about it. Bramwell's face went through several colors in rapid succession, settling finally on the gray of a man watching his reputation collapse in real time. He opened his mouth to protest, but Obed's gaze did not waver, and the words died before they were born. Obed turned to Fairchild. The Reverend stood rigid, his Bible clutched against his chest, but his eyes were not defiant. They were uncertain. The child he had come to save from witchcraft was sleeping peacefully in her father's arms, breathing easily alive. "You told me this was God's will," Obed said. "You told me her remedies were the devil's work. So tell me, Reverend, what is God's will now? Is it God's will that my daughter is alive? Did God send this woman to my door with the knowledge to save her? Or do you only hear God's voice when it agrees with yours?" Fairchild said nothing. His fingers tightened on the Bible and something shifted behind his eyes, a fracture in the bedrock of his certainty. Then Reva stepped through the front door. She looked at Fairchild and her expression was not triumphant. There was no vindication in her face, no satisfaction, no anger. She looked tired and gentle and entirely without malice, and when she spoke, her voice was soft. "Reverend, I know about the boy, Ephraim Cole. I understand why you did what you did. You were trying to protect people from a pain you carry every day." She paused. "But fear and truth are not the same thing. Being afraid does not make you right." Fairchild looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the sleeping child. Then he looked at the ground. He turned and walked to his buggy without a word, and when he climbed up and took the reins, his shoulders were hunched in a way they had not been when he arrived. Obed addressed the sheriff last. "There is no trouble here, Sheriff. Only a debt that can never be repaid. This woman is under my protection. Anyone in this town who speaks a word against her will answer to me." The sheriff nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and left. Bramwell followed his buggy, rattling down the road like a retreat. Obed looked at Reva across the porch, and the space between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had happened in the dark, the fear and the trust in the 3 words he had spoken over their joined hands. She held his gaze, and then she turned and went inside to check on the tea she had left steeping on the stove, because that was who she was. A woman who healed, a woman who moved forward. The seasons turned. Birdie grew strong, her laughter returning to the ranch house like birdsong, returning after a long winter. She ran in the yard with the ranch dogs, her dark hair flying behind her, and the sound of her voice calling for Peg carried across the property on the spring wind, and every man who heard it felt something ease inside his chest. Dr. Bramwell quietly packed his bags and left for a town further west where nobody had heard the story of the widow at the bar tea. The people he left behind did not miss him. Ansel Blackwood sold his ranch in February. The well Reva had found had made his dam irrelevant, and the fire he had set had made him unwelcome. Nobody in the county would buy his cattle or sell him feed, and in the end, he loaded his belongings into a wagon and disappeared down the road without a goodbye. Obed bought the adjoining land at auction for a price that was almost charitable. When he signed the papers in the land office, he looked at Reva, who had come to town with him in the wagon. "You found the water that made this possible," he said. "Half of that land belongs to you." "I do not want land," she said. "I want a place to grow things." He nodded, and something settled in his expression. A decision made, a plan forming behind those gray eyes. 3 weeks later, she understood what the nod had meant. Reverend Fairchild came to the bar tea on a morning in April. He arrived alone on horseback, his hat in his hand. He did not come to the front door. He came to the garden behind the cookhouse where Reva was on her knees in the dirt transplanting seedlings into the bed she had prepared. She looked up and saw him standing at the edge of the garden, and she saw that the rigidity was gone from his posture. He looked smaller somehow, as if the certainty that had held him upright for years had softened, and what remained was just a man tired and uncertain holding his hat. "My wife," he said, "her joints. The pain is bad, especially in the mornings. She cannot open her hands some days." Reva stood up, brushing dirt from her knees. She went into the kitchen and came back with a small cloth pouch tied with string. "Brew this as a tea," she said. "1 cup in the morning, 1 before bed. The stiffness should ease in a week." Fairchild took the pouch. He turned it over in his hands, looking at it the way a man looks at a letter written in a language he is only beginning to learn. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly. "You were afraid," Reva said. "Fear tells us lies in voices we trust." Fairchild looked at her, and for a moment something passed between them. That was not forgiveness, because forgiveness requires a request, and Fairchild had not quite arrived there yet. It was the beginning of understanding, the first tentative step across a bridge neither of them had known existed. He rode away, and Reva watched him go, and she thought about how the hardest ground sometimes yields the most unexpected growth. People from the neighboring homesteads began to come to the Bartee. They came with sick children and infected cuts and coughs that would not clear, and they did not come to see Obed. They came to see Mrs. Reva, and she turned none of them away. She treated them in the kitchen or the garden, depending on the weather, and Beulah would bring them coffee and look at them with the expression of a woman who had once served a healer on a chipped plate and was making up for it every day of her life. One cool evening in late May, Obed found Reva by her garden. It had grown since the fall, spreading out from its original patch into a lush, fragrant expanse of green and silver leaves, purple blossoms, and yellow flowers. But next to it, on the bare ground where nothing had stood before, 2 of his ranch hands were putting the finishing touches on a structure that Reva had not expected and had not asked for. It was a greenhouse. A small building made of timber and glass, solid and carefully built, with shelves inside for pots and a bench along one wall for working. It was not large, but it was beautiful, and it was permanent. It was a promise made of wood and nails and glass, a declaration that what grew here mattered enough to be protected through the winter and every winter after. Fenton Ashburn was standing nearby, watching the work with his arms crossed and a look of quiet satisfaction. "He drew the plans himself," Fenton told her when she approached. 2 in the morning, lamp burning in his office. "I saw the light 3 nights running." Reva stood in front of the greenhouse and pressed her hand against the glass. It was warm from the afternoon sun, and through it she could see the shelves waiting to be filled. The bench waiting for her hands, the space waiting to become what she would make of it. She heard his boots on the dirt behind her and turned. Obed was walking toward her from the direction of the barn. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and there was sawdust on his forearms, and she realized he had been working on the greenhouse himself, fitting the joints, sanding the shelves. He had built this with his hands, the way he had built everything on this ranch, but this was different. This was not for the ranch. This was for her. He stopped in front of her, and he saw the smudge of dirt on her cheek, and he reached out and brushed it away with his thumb. His hand was rough and warm against her skin, and it lingered there, his fingers resting on the curve of her jaw, and this time neither of them pulled away. "A healer on a ranch should have what she needs to do her work," he said, and his voice was quiet and steady, but underneath the steadiness, she could hear the tremor of a man saying something that cost him more than any words he had ever spoken. "You built this for me," she whispered. "I did." He reached into the pocket of his vest and brought out something small. He held it in his open palm, and the last light of the sun caught it and turned it to gold. It was the copper ring, Sidon's ring, the one Reva had carried for 6 months in 40 miles and a lifetime of grief. It had fallen from her bundle on the night she packed to leave, rolling under the bed in the moonlit room, and Obed had found it the next morning when the crisis was past and the light had returned. He had kept it for months, turning it over in his hands on sleepless nights, not knowing what to do with it, knowing only that it was not his to throw away. He placed it in her palm and closed her fingers over it. "This belongs to your past," he said. "I am not trying to replace it. I am not trying to erase the man who gave it to you. I am asking you to let me build something new, alongside it, not instead of it." Reva looked at the ring in her hand. She felt the weight of it, the worn copper, the memory of a young woman in a one-room church who believed the world would be kind. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone who had walked through fire and loss and suspicion and emerged not unmarked but unbroken, and she understood, standing in the shadow of a greenhouse, built by a man who could not sleep for thinking of her, that love was not the absence of pain, but the decision to grow in spite of it. She looked up at Obed. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face, open and undefended, every wall, down every door, unlocked. The gray eyes that had been cold as storm clouds when she first saw them were warm, now steady, full of a light that had nothing to do with the setting sun. "Obed," she said, "what are you asking me?" He took her hand. His calloused fingers laced through hers, and they fit together in a way that felt less like discovery and more like recognition, as if their hands had been waiting for each other without knowing it. "I need you to stay," he said, "not as a healer, not as a housekeeper, as my wife." She looked at the greenhouse, a testament to how he saw her and what he valued. She looked at the big house where a child's laughter was drifting through an open window, bright and clear. She looked at this man who had been forged in loss and hardened by grief and cracked open by desperation and put back together by the slow, patient work of trust. He had given her a place to stand when she had none. She had given him a reason to feel when he had forgotten how. He had saved her name in front of the men who would have destroyed it. She had saved his daughter with leaves and roots and the knowledge of a woman who had died before she could see how far her gift would travel. They had saved each other not once but again and again, in ways large and small, in the dark of sleepless nights and the light of ordinary mornings. "I walked 40 miles with nothing but holes in my shoes and a bag of dried herbs," she said, and her voice was thick and unsteady, and she did not try to make it otherwise. "I never thought I would find a place to stop walking." "Stop here," he said. His grip on her hand tightened. "With me." She smiled. It was a true smile, the kind that transforms a face from the inside out, the kind that arrives only when every defense has been lowered and every wound has been acknowledged, and the person standing before you has seen all of it and chosen to stay. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Obed, I will." He pulled her close, and she pressed her face against his chest, and she could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady, the heartbeat of a man who had learned that strength was not the same as hardness, that vulnerability was not weakness, that the bravest thing a person can do is not build a wall, but open a door. From the porch of the big house, Birdie watched them through the screen door, peg the cornhusk doll tucked under one arm. She turned to Beulah, who was standing behind her in the kitchen drying a plate. "Is Papa happy?" Birdie asked. Beulah looked through the screen at the two figures standing together in the garden, silhouetted against the last light, their hands joined, and the tough old woman who had spent 11 years guarding a kitchen and a grief that was not her own, felt something open in her chest that she had no word for. "Yes, child," Beulah said. "I believe he is." Birdie smiled and pushed through the screen door and ran down the steps, and Obed caught her with one arm and lifted her up, and Reva put her arm around them both, and the three of them stood together in the fading gold of the evening, while the greenhouse cast its shadow across the garden, and the hills rolled away in every direction, endless and indifferent and beautiful. Fenton Ashburn watched from the barn doorway, leaning on the frame, his weight on his good leg. He looked at the family in the garden, and he thought of Desta Sutterly, of a field hospital in Tennessee, of a woman with a leather pouch who had told him to drink something bitter and trust her, and he had cursed her, and she had saved him anyway. He looked down at his leg, the one the surgeon had wanted to take, the one that had carried him across 30 years and 1,000 miles to this place. This moment, this proof that what she had given her daughter was worth more than any diploma or any pulpit or any badge. He turned and walked into the barn, his limp a testament and a prayer, and the door swung shut behind him. On the porch of the big house, two rocking chairs sat side by side. They had been moved sometime during the long months of autumn and winter, pushed closer together inch by inch until their armrests touched. Nobody remembered who had moved them. Nobody asked. They sat together in the evening air, waiting for the two people who would fill them when the child was asleep and the lamps were lit and the long day's work was done, waiting for the quiet conversation that needed no words, the shared silence of two people who had found each other across 40 miles of dust and grief and learned in the hardest possible way that the love that grows in the most unforgiving soil is the love that lasts. The wind moved through the prairie grass, carrying the scent of thyme and lavender and fresh turned earth, and the lights of the bar-tea burned warm against the coming dark, and inside a child laughed, and the sound of it traveled out across the land and was not lost.